Welcome, Internet, to Psychologist Casual View. And today I wanted to do a little something special in the fact that last time I talked about feminine psychology, which is the previous video. However, I didn't quite feel complete. What I mean by that is that I felt that I didn't quite give all of the ideas, and I felt like I missed a couple of big ones, so it did not sit too well with me. So I wanted to remake a video with those new ideas. So I'll try and not tread any old ground, but to go forward, to go beyond. And sometimes in life it happens. It's a perfect timing because one of the commenters of the previous video informed me that apparently I was pronouncing it wrong. So it's not Karen Horney, as I thought, but Karen Horney. So thank you to that person. Thank you deeply, because I was unaware of that. So moving on, the interesting parts that I felt that I had left out of the previous video were mainly about frigidity, meaning the lack of pleasure during sexual relationships of women, and how, in a way, Karen Horney, I almost, but I didn't, so that's good. Moving on, she basically talks about how the frigidity is not to be understood as basically something that's normal, because apparently a lot of mental health professionals and even health care professionals at that time felt that it was normal for women to be frigid and not feel any pleasure during relationships at such a point where it didn't even occur to them that was a problem. So she says that it should not be considered normal or healthy to have that frigidity. And I felt that that was a very important point that I did not stress enough, that she really tried to break in a lot of ways the mold of what is to be expected of femininity, both on the side of men, but also on the side of women. That sometimes some expectations were unhealthy, unproductive. She never uses the word, but I'm going to use it because that's the idea, kind of toxic, and she really goes into those ideas. For example, one other thing that I felt was very, very important in the book was the idea of how love can be overvalued, how in a way love becomes the alpha and the omega, meaning that people put so much effort into that, like a successful life is a life where one has a stable partner, one loves and is loved. But she says that unfortunately sometimes it can turn against the person, that the person in a way can mask their hatred with the love. And that was a very interesting idea, that in a way she feels that some people, especially people that were not fully loved as children, in a way pretend to love, but give hate in a way that's very destructive, very brutal. And she says that sometimes, at least in the clinical field she saw and the patients she had, sometimes some women could have a baseline that would seem homosexual, but it's not, because it's destructive, that homosexuality is just a facade for the hate of the therapist and by displacement of the mother. And I found that that was very interesting. She said you should not mix the fact of having people who are fully in love with a partner of the same gender, which is, she says, in a way, she doesn't say it's healthy, but she says that it's completely different from someone that's both hating of men and women, but is going to hate women through a veneer of love. But in a way, there's a destructiveness that's always there, always boiling, which I found very interesting because it's not a distinction that we make nowadays. So I found that to be very, very interesting, as I said. And basically, Horney has this whole perspective also that there's an idealization of monogamy in our cultures, that people have to be monogamous, but it comes with a caveat that basically it's women that have to apply the monogamy. Men, it's not so much so. Like, there is, of course, the baseline that it should be done, but also there is a cultural understanding, and it's not going to be the case. So in a way, women are, at least in the 30s, were left with the fact of having to assume the monogamy and having to be crushed by the cultural ideal that they had to stay within the monogamy, whereas men were freer in a way. And she says that it's not the case all everywhere, and that's something also that I've left out, how she uses anthropology to show that it's not a universal trend, that all of these sins are based in culture. And that's also another big break with Freud, as Freud postulates his theories of drives, of universality, of constantness. She says that it's very dependent upon where we are, which culture we live in, and that in our culture, at least in the 30s, monogamy was an ideal, an unreachable ideal, an unattainable ideal, and that it stressed, in a way, it was stressed on women to uphold it, uplift it, where men were not so much into that. And she also says that the fear and the anxieties are different from each gender, which I found very interesting. She said that men basically have the big anxiety of being swallowed, of being, in a way, reabsorbed. She never says it's straightly, but it gives that idea, because she talks about how it's been reabsorbed in liquid environment, and aquatique, we would say in French, meaning all this liquid. And she never states it outright, I think, but we can see the fear of being reabsorbed into the uterus being underlined. Whereas women, it's more subtle than that. They're afraid of being destroyed, of having their ego destroyed, meaning the self, right? Not the ego, not the narcissism, the self being destroyed by mutilation, or being wrecked by mutilation. And she links it with the castration anxiety, because according to her, there is a fantasy which I glossed over in the first part of this criticism or review of Karen Horney. Old habits die hard. So basically, Horney, to move on, basically states that the castration anxiety with women is that women do believe, at least at a younger stage, that they had masculine genitalia, but it's and they feel that because of repeated self-pleasure, that organ fell off, that basically they were penisless because of the pleasure seeking, and basically they're gonna internalize that it's their fault, that they took too much pleasure, and then they will repress it in order to by fear, and in order to seep into society and the collective, but also for fear of losing what they still have. And she says that that's the main anxiety of women, whereas men, it's more to be reabsorbed and to lose themselves within a uterus-like lining, which is very, very interesting to me. And I feel that, at least on the male counterpart, it's very true that some men are very afraid of women because they're afraid of being cancelled or reabsorbed into them, which I found to be clinically very, very interesting, very important. There's also an idea that I completely avoided in the first video, but I'm going to tackle now. It's the idea of masculine complex within women. The fact that women flee from the femininity and try and become pseudo-men. It's not to I don't think one should, confuse that with transgenderness. I think she's onto something completely different. That they want the role of activity, of power, of basic dominance, because that's what they associate with being a man. But she does say that it's a caricature. It's not true. It's not true for them, and it's not true for the outside world. What they want is to flee from femininity, because they've seen other women suffer. They've seen other women lacking. And basically they are afraid that that lack, that fear will be pushed onto them, that they will be destroyed in a way. So in order to avoid that, they break off completely from femininity into a more male-ish role, a more power-hungry, ambition-hungry role of what they think is manly, right? But, and you have to understand that on the surface we might think, oh, that's great, that means that in a way they're fighting for feminine causes. But she says that no, they don't. They become worse in a way than men. Because they can become a caricature, they also push down other women, break other women, as they see them as weak because they've chosen femininity. So in a way they identify to the aggressor. She never says it like that, but that's what I got from it. And that identification in a way is hurtful both for the women that are doing it and for other women, and even for other men, as they start seeing, because they will not see the masculine side, they will see her as a woman trying to in a way break the codes, or even worse, a woman that exemplifies the worst in women. So it's for Horney, it's a lose-lose-lose situation, at least if I understood this correctly. And I found that to be very interesting, very, in a way, very deep, as it's true that men and women have both ideas on femininity, and that both of those ideas sometimes are contradictory in the fact that men are expecting women to be a bit like them mothers, or at least a mother figure, being soft, being nice, being kind, etc., etc. Whereas women sometimes see themselves as more proactive, more ambitious, more, how can I say, more into the active and proactive societal sides. That's something that I think since the 30s we've at least advanced culturally on this, that women are given a more proactive roles in society. And I think that at least on that, it's a good evolution of society. And I think that that was very, very true in her day. And thanks to all of our comprehension, things have grown better. And I think that that's one of the interesting things of reading this book in the now and looking back, is you see how much of a leap there is. But as much as there is a leap, there is also a limit on that leap, meaning that when she talks about the couples, because that's another thing that I found very interesting, she does talk about couple relationships. And you always have that idea that, oh, in the old days it was so much easier, people did not divorce, people were happy, people were just so solid, and basically the unit was a true couple unit, a true family. But she does state that there's so many problems, and that relationships always need compromise. If not, they're going to go bad. And I think that that's something that, at least looking at it now and looking back, you kind of think that, oh no, relationships were always complicated. It's a fantasy, a collective fantasy, that we believe that things were better back in the day, at least in terms of human and gender relationships. They were not. And I found that great, because it's so easy to think that previous generations had it better, or understood better, or just were better because they were together. They were not. And she states it. She states that it's always complicated, and that she doesn't go through the easy explanation of, oh, it was better before, because she realizes in her essays that it's always going to require a compromise between both men, husband and wife, or now two wives or two husbands. But relationships always imply compromise, and that's something that I also did not talk about, but she is very good in this book, I felt. And even though, as I stated in the first video, there was a lot of things that have aged poorly, there's a lot of things that I felt were incredibly thorough, incredibly interesting, and also that are an eye-opening on the past and on the present, and that was wonderful, at least for me. So I hope that I've addressed everything in this addendum. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm sorry to make two videos on the same book, but it's just I felt that I needed to express all the ideas I didn't. So anyway, I'll see you in the next one. So bye.